I'll never forget the morning it started. January 15th, 1947. A cold, gray dawn in Los Angeles that felt more like a shroud than a sunrise. The call came early, crackling through the station's switchboard. A woman's body, found in Limert Park, a quiet patch of nothing off Norton Avenue. I'd seen my share of death, stabbings, shootings, the messy ends of messy lives, but nothing prepared me for what waited in that vacant lot. As my Chevy bumped over the uneven dirt, I caught the first glimpse. A crowd of gawkers, reporters buzzing like flies, and two halves of a human being laid out like a grotesque offering. I pushed through the throng, barking at uniforms to cordon it off, but the damage was done. Shoe prints and tire tracks trampled into chaos. There she was, split clean at the waist, torso and legs a foot apart, posed with a precision that turned my stomach. Her arms stretched up at sharp angles, like she was reaching for something she'd never grasp. Her legs splayed wide, shameless and deliberate. The face, God, the face was the worst. Slashed from mouth to ears, a twisted, bloody grin carved into her skull, mocking us with its silence. No blood pooled beneath her, just dewy grass. Clean, too clean. She'd been washed, butchered elsewhere, then dumped here like trash. I crouched beside her, the chill seeping through my coat, and took in the details. Cuts marred her breasts and thighs, chunks of flesh sliced away with surgical care. Rope marks circled her wrists and neck, faint, cruel echoes of her last moments. Her insides were tucked under her hips, neat as a package, a final insult from a mind that savored its work. This wasn't rage or panic. This was art to someone, cold, calculated, and sick. I pressed a hand to my mouth, fighting the bile, and wondered, who could do this? Who had the stomach to turn a girl into a canvas of pain? The crowd's whispers faded as I stood, staring at her ruined form. Betty Bersinger had found her, out with her kid, thinking it was a busted mannequin till the truth hit. By the time Detectives Hansen and Brown rolled up with me, the press, Aggie Underwood leading the pack, had their lenses trained on her, snapping shots that'd plaster front pages by noon. I wanted to shield her, give her some dignity, but dignity was long gone. The air hung heavy, damp with fog, and something darker, a presence maybe, watching us fumble in its wake. Back at the station, I couldn't shake it. That grin, those cuts, the way she'd been laid out. It wasn't just murder. It was a statement. Someone had taken their time, reveling in every slice, every twist of the knife. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like a ghost, and stared at the wall. This wasn't a crime I'd solve quick. It was a descent into a mind I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I had to. Whoever she was, whatever she'd been, she deserved that much. The brutality wasn't just in her death. It was in the silence she left behind. A silence screaming for answers I didn't have yet. The station was a hive by midday, phones ringing off the hook, typewriters clacking like gunfire. Hansen and Brown stood over the crime scene photos, faces grim, while I nursed a coffee gone cold. That body, split, slashed, posed, burned behind my eyes, a nightmare I couldn't blink away. We had nothing, no name, no weapon, just a heel print in the dirt and a cement sack dripping watery blood. The crowd had trampled the rest. Reporters like Aggie Underwood snapping shots while evidence vanished under their heels. I cursed them silently. They'd turned our start into a circus. "We need her name," Hansen growled, jabbing a finger at the Polaroids. "No blood means she was killed elsewhere. Dumped after 2 a.m., per the due. Start there." Brown nodded, already dialing the coroner. I grabbed the sack and the jewelry, rings, earrings, faint glints of a life, and headed to the morgue. The air there was thick with antiseptic and death, a sterile mask over the rot. They'd printed her fingers, smudged but usable, and I handed them off to a uniform with orders to rush them to the examiner. The press had their uses. Their sound photo could beam those prints to the FBI faster than our red tape. Hours dragged, the clock mocking us with every tick. I paced, replaying the scene, those cuts, that grin, the precision of it all. This wasn't a drunk's rage or a lover's spat. It was a butcher's work, someone who knew flesh and bone like a map. Then the call came. FBI hit a match. Elizabeth Short, 22, Boston-born, prints on file from a mailroom gig at Camp Cook and a juvie bust in Santa Barbara. A photo followed, grainy but striking. Pale skin, dark hair, eyes that promised more than her life delivered. Black Dahlia, the examiner dubbed her later, latching onto her style. Black suits, sheer blouses, like it explained the horror. I dug into her file, piecing her together. A dreamer, chasing Hollywood's glitter, drifting from Medford to Miami to LA. She'd loved soldiers. Matthew Gordon Jr., dead in a crash, left her broken, and bounced between men who fed her hopes or her rent. Last seen January 9th, dropped at the Biltmore by Robert Red Manley, a salesman with a wife back in San Diego. She'd called someone from the lobby, staff said, then vanished. 6 days later, she was in that lot, a grotesque doll for the world to gape at. I scribbled it down. Biltmore, Manley, the lost week, knowing it was just the edge of the abyss. Back at the scene that night, I stood alone, fog curling around me like a noose. The lot was empty now, but her presence lingered. Those slashed lips whispering secrets I couldn't hear. We had her name, but it only deepened the shadows. Who'd she call? Where'd she go? The brutality wasn't random. It was personal. A message carved in flesh by a hand that savored control. I thought of the rope marks, the missing meat, trophies maybe, and felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. This was no petty killer. This was a mind that planned, that waited. Hanson called me back as I lit a smoke. Manley's coming in tomorrow. Says he's clean, but we'll see. Coroner's got more soon. I nodded into the receiver, staring at Short's photo on my desk. Elizabeth, Bet to her friends, had walked into a trap, and we were miles behind. The press would feast on her beauty, spin her into a siren. But I saw a girl lost, caught by a beast who'd left us nothing but her ruin. Her name was a start, but it was also a taunt. Proof we'd only scratched the surface of the darkness that claimed her. January 9th, 1947. That's where the trail starts, or ends, depending on how you look at it. Robert Red Manley dropped Elizabeth Short at the Biltmore Hotel, 6:30 p.m. His auburn hair catching the lobby's chandelier glow as he waved goodbye. She'd been with him in San Diego, a fling born on a street corner, but he swore they hadn't tangled sheets. Just a ride north, her luggage checked at the bus station. A story about meeting her sister in Berkeley. I sat him down the next day, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. She made a call from the lobby, he said, voice tight. Then I left. That's it. Polygraph backed him up, needles steady as stone. He wasn't our man, but he was our last anchor before she slipped into the void. The Biltmore staff remembered her. Black suit, sheer blouse, a silhouette against marble and crystal. She'd lingered by the phone, dialing someone, her lips moving in a conversation lost to time. Then she walked out, heels clicking into the LA night, and vanished. 6 days later, she was in that lot, carved up like a nightmare. What happened in between? I stood in that lobby myself, Days after, the air thick with perfume and ghosts. Who'd she call? A friend? A lover? The beast who'd paint her blood across Limert Park? The question gnawed at me, a splinter I couldn't pull. Witnesses trickled in, their stories flimsy as smoke. Crown Grill patrons, half a block from the Biltmore, claimed they'd seen her that night, sipping something strong, her dark hair pinned with flowers. A bartender swore she'd flirted with a guy, shadowy, forgettable, gone by closing. Another said she'd left alone, stepping into the fog. I walked Olive Street at dusk, neon buzzing overhead, picturing her, Bet, the dreamer, moving through the crowd. Was she hunting company or being hunted? The city swallowed her whole, and every lead dissolved like mist when we pressed it. I dug deeper, chasing shadows. She'd bounced between flops, hotels, boarding houses, friends' couches, since July 46 back in LA to chase Joseph Fickling's promises. Letters we found showed a rocky dance. He sent cash. She sent flirtations. Neither fully committed. January 8th, she'd written him about Chicago, a modeling gig, a fresh start. Did she mean to leave? Or was it a lie to mask despair? I imagined her those last days, penniless, restless, drifting Hollywood's fringes. Maybe she'd hit a bar, caught an eye, accepted a ride from the wrong hand. That week was a black hole, and I felt it pulling me in. The brutality haunted me most. Whoever took her didn't just kill, they sculpted. 6 days to tie her, beat her, slice her apart with a surgeon's calm. I pictured it. Her screams muffled in some basement, his blade tracing her face, savoring the terror. Was it rage? Revenge? Or a twisted thrill? A game played out in her flesh. The lost week wasn't just a gap. It was his canvas. Time to craft his masterpiece before tossing her to us. I drove past the Biltmore nightly, headlights cutting the dark, wondering where he'd lured her. Hollywood's underbelly, a quiet house, a car idling on a back road, tips flooded in. Cranks, mostly. A dame at the Astor Motel claimed a bloody room, but Wharton shot it down in 49. No link. Others swore they'd seen her, a black-clad wraith, but faces blurred, times clashed. I stood in that lot again, wind biting my neck, her absence louder than the city's hum. January 9th to 15, 6 days of silence, then a scream carved into eternity. She'd trusted someone, followed them into the abyss, and they'd repaid her with a knife. The week was gone, but it held the key. His shadow, his motive, his glee. I'd find it, or it'd bury me too. The autopsy report landed on my desk January 16th, a stack of cold facts that burned hotter than any lead. Coroner Frederick Newbar had laid it out. Elizabeth Short, 5'5", 115 pounds, light blue eyes drowned in death, brown hair dyed black to match her fate. I skimmed the pages, but the details clawed at me. Each line a testament to a brutality that wasn't just murder, it was a ritual. She'd been split in two, waist severed with a cut so clean it screamed expertise. Hemicorporectomy, Newbar called it. A surgeon's trick from the 30s, slicing through spine and cord like butter. No bruising along the incision. He'd done it post-mortem, a final flourish after the real torment. Her face was the centerpiece, slashed from mouth to ears, a Glasgow smile that turned her into a grotesque puppet. 3 inches on the right, 2.5 on the left, carved with a blade that knew its way around flesh. I stared at her morgue photo, that grin mocking me, and felt the room tilt. He'd beat her first. Bruises on her scalp, right side bleeding into her skull, massive hemorrhage and shock, Newbar ruled. Blows to the head killed her, but the rest? That was for him. Rope marks on her wrists, ankles, neck. Faint, deep, a map of her captivity. She'd been bound, helpless, while he played his game. The cuts went deeper. Her right breast bore an irregular gash, tissue peeled away like he was harvesting her. Thighs, too, flesh excised with a butcher's care, chunks gone, maybe kept as souvenirs. A 4-inch laceration split her abdomen, jagged and cruel, spilling her insides before he tucked them back, neat under her hips. Gasoline had washed her clean. No prints, no blood at the scene. Just a sterile shell dumped in the fog. I leaned back, cigarette trembling in my hand, picturing it. Her tied down, alive for the beating. Maybe the first cuts. His eyes gleaming as she faded. This wasn't impulse. It was choreography, every slice a note in his symphony of pain. I walked the station's halls that night, report in hand, the words echoing like footsteps in a crypt. Who does this? A madman? A genius? Both? The precision screamed training, medical, maybe military, someone who'd held a scalpel before a knife. But the savagery, the grin, the trophies, spoke of something darker, a mind that fed on control, on turning a girl into meat. I saw her in my head, those last hours, rope biting her skin, his shadow looming, the blade glinting as he chose his cuts. Was it rage? Lust? Or a message scrawled in her ruin for us to decode? The lot offered scraps, a heel print, tire tracks, that bloody sack. But the body was his signature. He'd posed her, arms up, legs spread, a sick tableau meant to shock. I'd seen killers before, quick, sloppy, desperate. But this was different. This was pride, a taunt to the world. Catch me if you can. I thought of surgeons I'd met, their steady hands, and wondered if one could snap, trade healing for havoc. The brutality wasn't just in the act. It was in the planning, the patience, the pleasure he took in breaking her apart. 6 days, that lost week, he'd had her. Time to bind, to beat, to carve his mark. Back at my desk, I stubbed out the smoke, the ashtray overflowing like my thoughts. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a love letter to cruelty, written in her blood. Whoever he was, he'd left her as proof of his skill, his sickness, his power. I'd find him, not just for her, but to silence that grin echoing in my nightmares. The devil had marked her, and now he'd marked me too, dragging me into a hunt where the prey was a shadow and the stakes were my sanity. By 49, the Black Dahlia case was a ghost haunting the precinct, its leads fraying like old rope. Then George Hodel's name slithered in. A doctor, rich, polished, with a house on Franklin Avenue that screamed privilege and secrets. He'd surfaced late, after the confessors and dead ends, when we'd grilled Red Manley and Mark Hansen to dust. It started with his daughter, Tamar, 14, accusing him of molesting her, even impregnating her, forcing an abortion in 49. The trial was a circus. Witnesses backed her up, but Hodel walked, his charm a shield. That's when Hansen nudged me. A doctor, precise cuts, sound familiar? I dug into him, and the shadows grew teeth. Hodel wasn't just a healer. He was a predator cloaked in respectability. Ruth Spaulding, his secretary, died in 45. Suicide, they called it, pills down her throat. But whispers said he'd staged it. Then 50 hit, and we wired his place, February to March, ears pressed to the static. Most was mundane, business, boasts, but one tape stopped me cold. "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia," he said to some baron, voice smooth as ice. "They couldn't prove it now. Can't talk to my secretary anymore. She's dead." A laugh followed, sharp like he'd sliced the air. Later, a woman's scream cut through, then silence. We listened, frozen, but didn't raid. Cowards or fools, I still don't know. That voice stuck with me. Calm, smug, a man who owned the room even when it bled. I saw Short's body in my mind, the hemicorporectomy, the Glasgow smile, flesh carved like a butcher's pride. Hodel had the skill, years with a scalpel, nerves of steel, and the sickness. His psychology unfolded like a black flower. Control was his god, pain his gospel. Tamar's story hinted at it, dominance over the helpless, a thrill in breaking them. Spaulding's death, Short's mutilation. It fit a man who saw people as toys, to bend or break at whim. I pictured him with her that week, rope tight, her pleas fueling him, his blade tracing her fate with a lover's care. We built a case. Jemison from the DA's office took point. Wiretaps, Spaulding's file, Short's precision cuts, enough to charge him by April 50. But Hodel smelled the net closing. Late March, he bolted. Hawaii, then the Philippines, gone like smoke. I stood in his empty house later, the air stale, imagining her there, bound in a back room, his hands steady as he worked. No blood, no screams left, just echoes of a monster who'd outrun us. Jemison fumed. We know who did it, a doctor, but we couldn't nail him. The DA's vault held the proof decades later, labeled Hodel Black Dahlia, but by then it was ash on a grave. Nights after, I'd replay it. His voice, that scream, her ruined face. Hodel wasn't just brutal. He was a maestro of it, orchestrating terror with a surgeon's touch. He'd taken her apart not to hide her, but to show her. His power, his art, a taunt we'd never answer. I saw his mind in those cuts, cold, calculating, reveling in every flinch. He'd fled, but left his mark, on her, on us, a shadow laughing from exile. The lost week was his stage, her body his curtain call, and we'd missed the show. I slammed the file shut, but his grin, hers, stayed. A devil's brand on a case that'd never close. The Black Dahlia case never left me. It's a scar, etched deep, that flares up on quiet nights. I left the force in '55, but Short's file stayed. A battered relic on my shelf, her slashed face staring through time. Hodel's shadow looms largest, his hands, steady with a blade, carving her into a scream that still echoes. That lost week, January 9th to 15, gnaws at me most. 6 days where she slipped from the Biltmore's glow into his grip, a void where he wove his brutality. I see her bound, his cold eyes gleaming, her flesh yielding to a mind that found joy in ruin. No witnesses, no trail, just a body split and posed, his final laugh. I walked Norton Avenue years later, the lot grown over, but her presence lingered. Those cuts, that grin, a testament to a cruelty I couldn't cage. Hodel's tapes play in my head. Supposin' I did kill her. His voice a taunt from across oceans, safe in exile till he died in '99. We had him, Jemison swore it, but he danced free, leaving Short's justice in the dust. Her week vanished with him, where he took her, how he broke her, a secret locked in a mind that savored every slice. The brutality wasn't just in the act. It was in his silence, his escape, the way he turned her into a riddle we couldn't solve. LA moved on. New cases, new headlines. But Short stayed, a ghost in black. Her story warped by the press into a siren's tale. I knew better. She was a dreamer, caught by a devil who painted his darkness across her skin. I'd sit with her file, tracing the lost days, imagining the basement, the car, the room where he worked. Was it rage, pride, or a hunger only blood fed? Hodel's psychology, control, power, glee, fit the cuts, the pose, the trophies he might have kept. He'd won, and that stung worse than the failure. His mark on her, on me, a wound that wouldn't heal. Now, old and gray, I ask, what did we miss? A scream in the night? A shadow on Olive Street? The truth's out there, buried with him or lost to time, but it whispers still, through her ruined lips, through the fog of 47. Elizabeth Short waits, a name without peace, her killer's brutality a chain we couldn't break. I close my eyes, see that lot, feel his presence, calm, cruel, untouchable. Will we ever know? I doubt it. But for her, for the girl beneath the grin, we owe it to listen, to wonder, to chase the darkness one last time.